أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية سيدي ومولاي علي بن أبي طالب، والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful, we ask Allah to send His greatest peace and blessings upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We praise Allah for all the blessings He has given us, and the greatest blessing being that He allowed us to be of the ones who remain steadfast, dedicated, and loyal on the path of our Master after the Prophet, the commander of the faithful, the prince of the believers, the protector of the Prophet and his message, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. We praise Allah for this blessing and every blessing, for without Allah we would have nothing. Assalamu alaikum, my dear respected brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation that we've been having, the discussions that we've been having in the theme of the vision of a virtuous community. Now, we've come a very long way, and we've discussed a number of things that provide the foundations of what is this divine mandate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us, humanity, in that in His creation, He has a vision for us through His viceroys, through His representatives, that He wishes for us to be that virtuous community. What does it look like, and how can you and I in this modern day attain this virtuous community and build towards it? Today we're going to be talking about something specific that is to minority communities. Specifically when it comes to the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, and as we've discussed before, in their capacity as a socio-religious identity, which is the domain that we've been focusing on, that core identity that we've referred to as followers of Ahlul Bayt, also as Shia Muslims, that core identity, when you look at it, how is that identity taken into engagement within society at large? So beyond the community that one is actually living in and existing in, there's a society that encompasses that community specifically. We're going to be examining the options of societal engagement for Muslims against the backdrop of history and the application to our modern day challenges. Specifically when it comes to Shia Muslims that are a minority within Islam and have been a minority generally throughout history, what has been their experience and how is that taken into the modern day? Now, we're going to be addressing, like every day we have been, there's a number of questions that we're going to be going over. Those questions that we're going to be going over are the following. There's 5 questions for today that we're going to be breaking down. The first question is, have Shia Muslims particularly always been a minority historically? Secondly, what was the program of assimilation through self-assertion, as it was coined in African American history? Thirdly, how does isolationism harbor animosity for minority communities? Fourth, what is the history of religious persecution that existed in Islam and before Islam, and what is at-ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah? Fifth and finally, what was the litmus test for Hammad's success as a Muslim living abroad? Hammad being one of the companions of the Ahlul Bayt, of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're going to jump right into this conversation and start off with question number 1. From a historical perspective, when you look at the Shia Muslim community, the Shia have always been a minority community wherever they've been. On a very general level, that has been the characteristic of Shia Muslim communities. With the exception of specific places in the world, like modern day Iran and the Safavid Empire, which the Safavid Empire at one point actually was not even one that prescribed to the Shia school of thought, but at one point it actually changed that and became part of the Shia school of thought by the decision of its leadership, of the rulers of that time in the 16th century. Now, when you're looking at the Shia Muslim community worldwide, the Shia Muslim community, wherever it has been, whether it was in the cradle of Islam, being Mecca and Medina, or you're looking at any other part of the world, generally the Shia Muslim community has been a minority. Now, the collective Shia community's experience with government and civic society has been one that has generally been very diverse. And again, still with the exception of modern day Iran and the Safavid Empire, for the most part, it was always that Shia Muslims lived under a dominant rule of some other type of group. Now, we can also look at references, or we can refer to other communities, Shia communities that exist as majorities in number, like Azerbaijan, um, Bahrain, possibly arguably in Lebanon. But for the most part, those communities exist in their engagement within that society, exist not necessarily as a socio-religious group, but exist more so in a civic or secular capacity when it comes to their engagement with the rest of society. Now, it's important here to mention this. Why? Because the existence of a group socially has an impact on its rights, has an impact on the way other groups interact with it, how they are treated, how they are safeguarded. All of this has an impact on how people are with one another. And again, like we're looking at historically, if we study history, Shia Muslims have generally existed as minorities wherever they have gone, with the exception of a couple examples, like we mentioned, Iran and the Safavid Empire. Now, that's important for us to realize, because then as a minority group within this identity, there's a lot that we can benefit from in the experiences of other communities. Specifically when it comes to us, let's say here living in the United States or living in the United Kingdom or other parts of the Western world, there's a lot of benefit that we can have from the experiences of other groups. Now, the second question that we wanted to jump into was, what was the program of assimilation through self-assertion that is referred to in the African American community, in the African American experience? Now, this is one that when we're looking at the general options for engagement as minorities in a community, you have a few options. The two main options that exist are isolation and assimilation. As a minority coming into a group that is larger than I am and has different norms, different lifestyles, different values, different customs, traditions, beliefs, etc., I have the ability to either go into that society and assimilate, as in become one with that society, and possibly let go of some of my identity, some of my values, some of my principles, my norms, my heritage, etc., for the purpose of engaging in that society and becoming accepted as part of that society. The other option is I am going to exist in that society, but I'm going to isolate myself from the rest of the society in order to preserve my heritage, my tradition, my religion, my values, my principles, my identity, etc., 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 that I am bringing into the society. Now, in the African American experience with W.E.B. Du Bois, as also prescribed, and what he described was the program of Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois coined this term or this phrase, assimilation through self-assertion. The African American community was at a point in its history of how do they, after slavery, engage in their society, which was a predominantly non-Black society, a white society, in which they were just enfranchised in becoming beyond property, a very unique experience collectively as an African American community. And they faced this challenge when it came to, do we isolate ourselves, as in do we just live segregated from the rest of our society, from the people that are different than us? In this discussion here, it was a racial a distinction between the minority and the majority. Or do we assimilate with the rest of society and possibly lose some parts of who we are? And the advantage of assimilation is that we're going to be actually getting some benefit by being accepted people, or in this context, as African Americans, the American way, let's say, right? Again, this being a racial conversation, a racial discussion from a racial minority into the majority that existed in the United States. Now, what W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass were pushing for was an idea called assimilation through self-assertion, which basically meant we want to assimilate into society. However, we want to assert our identity, our heritage, our tradition, our customs, our values, etc., as African Americans. that we're going to assert our identity and we're not going to allow it to melt away. Effectively, what that essentially became was integration. Now, when you're looking at integration, integration is that middle ground between isolation and assimilation. It's not taking yourself away from the community absolutely so that you may maintain the identity, nor is it one where you're assimilating completely in society in a way where you're losing your identity and losing what you came with from this society or from your heritage and from the places that you originally came from, whether it be as an immigrant community or one that you've existed for a long time in the society that you're living in, but happen to be facing this challenge of engagement as it is now, as the African American community did back in the 1800s. Now, when we look specifically at isolationism and assimilation, there's principles that we have from Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, from our faith, from the Quran and from the tradition of the Prophet and his family, as in how did they look at isolationism and how did they look at assimilation? We refer to this example from a historical background and from a practical level of how did other Americans or how did other minority groups in the United States of America deal with their challenge of being a minority group and engaging with the rest of their society. And that's a key discussion for us to contemplate on as we have. But the third question comes into play and discusses the significance of isolationism and its connection to animosity. Now, when we look closely, we can find that the more isolated a group are, the more connected to animosity this group may be. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam says, الناس أعداء ما جهلوا, that people are enemies of what they do not know. Very simply put, ignorance is not bliss. And it's something that can turn man against his fellow man. It can turn a brother against another brother. Ignorance is not something that should be disregarded as it's okay, it's fine if people are ignorant about things, because once you're ignorant, you actually induce fear. And once fear exists, then people act irrationally. And when people act irrationally, people can get hurt. Take the example that the experience that took place for many Americans post 9/11, and even people around the world from Muslim communities and people that quote unquote looked like Muslim communities, the experience that they had post 9/11, what happened? There was a number of hate crimes that took place in the United States and abroad as a reaction to Muslims and the terrorist attacks that took place on 9/11. Now, we know from our perspective, definitely, anybody that understands Islam, that Islam had nothing to do with the attacks on 9/11, and that those individuals, regardless of their faith that they claim to have, that was an act of terrorism. However, people not necessarily being engaged or knowing Muslims reacted very irrationally to that situation, so that any Muslim that they saw or anyone that they presumed to be Muslim, they felt hatred towards, and then certain hate crimes also were induced in those scenarios, in those situations. Look at this example of how many individuals that weren't even Muslim, but in fact were Sikhs, that have been victims of anti-Muslim hate crimes even 15 years after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The first revenge killing that actually took place after 9/11 took the life of a young man. His name was Balbir Singh Sodhi. Sodhi was an Indian Sikh immigrant. The assailant said he wanted to go out and shoot some towel heads for the actions of Osama bin Laden. It goes to show that how much ignorance is involved here, that this person would go out and kill an individual who wasn't even belonging to the faith of those that he wanted to hurt and harm. Now, why did this take place? That though the man wasn't even a Muslim, he was killed by someone that harbored resentment towards Islam. To the assailant, a Muslim looked a certain way, and that Sikh immigrant fit the description of what he thought a Muslim looked like. Because he looked Muslim in the way he thought, he was going to take his revenge on this person. And how does Muslim look like in his mind? It's someone who's dark, long bearded, and wearing a turban. And this can apply to a number of different people culturally and religiously from different groups. So this individual, because of his ignorance, He acted on a phobia or a fear, and he took the life of another human being. And taking the life of another human being who wasn't even part of that group that he wanted to harm or hurt. Now, fear and ignorance, like we said, they go hand in hand, usually leading to devastating outcomes for minority communities across the world, be it in the United States or abroad. Isolation, be it by those perpetuating hate or those receiving it, that only fuels the sensational fire of fear and ignorance. And what we mean by that is, if a community is isolated, whether it's a majority community or a minority community, isolation only brings about more hate, only brings about more ignorance. And we see that, practically speaking, as Imam Ali alayhi salam tells us, that when people are ignorant of something, they're going to be induced by fear, and they're going to act on it in a way that can bring harm to people. So the position of a minority community like ourselves is to be one who contemplates and thinks, I want to protect my community. I want to protect my brothers and sisters. I want to make sure that people are taken care of. I need to think, how much do people know about my community, so much so that they realize that we're not a threat, that we are people just like they are, that we care for our families, that we're raising a generation of people that are going to be good citizens, that are going to be good leaders, that are going to be serving our community, our society at large, regardless of the faith tradition that they belong to, that we're professionals, we're business owners, we're people that love and care and serve just like anybody else. They won't know that if we're isolated. And we won't know that if they're isolated. It goes both ways. In order for us to bring people closer together, to at the very least not harm one another, we need to be of ones who are engaged and not isolated. Moving forward into the conversation of isolationism and assimilation comes the very important point, which is the experience of religious persecution and the backdrop of that history in our faith tradition, and what became known as the concept of ta'arrub ba'd al-hijra. In question 4, we're asking, what is this experience that we had with religious persecution, and what is this idea of at-ta'arrub ba'd al-hijra? There are a number of examples that exist in the Holy Quran and in the history of the Prophet and his family with regards to religious persecution. Take the example of Prophet Moses, Prophet Musa alayhi salam, when he goes to the experience of fleeing from the Pharaoh. In the Holy Quran, in chapter 28, verses 21 and 22, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the situation that Musa is in. And he says, so he left the city, fearful and vigilant. And he said, my Lord, deliver me from the wrongdoing lot. And when he turned his face towards Midian, he said, maybe my Lord will show me the right way. So when in his move to Midian, he's fleeing persecution and protecting his faith and well-being. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, goes from one city onto the next, one area onto the next, with the pursuit of saving his life from who? From individuals that were persecuting him for his beliefs, for his faith. So he goes on to the next place to make sure that he is protected and safeguarded from his faith, or safeguarded from the individuals that were persecuting him because of what he believed. Now, similarly, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his followers went through intolerable measures of religious persecution during the first days, in the earliest days of Islam in Mecca, the Prophet instructed some of his followers to take safe haven in Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia. Now, he instructed a group of his followers to go to Abyssinia under the direction of the person he appointed as essentially the lead of the group, was Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, his cousin. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet, takes this group of people and he leads a band of Muslims to Abyssinia. The Prophet gave Ja'far a number of detailed instructions on how they need to behave and engage with people in Abyssinia. Most of those instructions were centered around respecting the people that were their hosts. So they were going to Abyssinia, which was a Christian kingdom. And at that time, it had a Christian ruler who was essentially very tolerant, very open-minded, and he welcomed the Muslims in. The Prophet instructed Ja'far to preach to the Christians. Do not preach our faith to them. Do not try to convert them. Respect their laws, respect their land, respect their property. Treat them with kindness and be with them as a harmonious community. He made sure that there was no infringement whatsoever in any way upon their faith and upon the practice of their faith. He said basically, be as you are, practice your faith, and appreciate those that who are welcoming you and providing you a safe haven in their community, in their land. Now, when it comes to that experience that was had by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, by Prophet Musa alayhi salam, and by others that were fleeing religious persecution and were going towards communities that allowed them to practice their faith and practice their religion, there's also this concept of at-ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. Imam Ali alayhi salam narrates from the Prophet. He said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi told me, Ya Ali, la ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. Oh Ali, there is no going back. At-ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. There's no ta'arrub after hijrah. Ta'arrub was a reference to being uncivilized, to being one of the pre-Islamic days, as in the age of ignorance. There's no going back to that state after the hijrah. The hijrah, as in the migration, was symbolic for now we've safeguarded ourselves and our faith from the persecution of those that are coming to persecute us as Muslims for what we believe in. After we've made the migration, there's no going back to a state of disbelief. There's no going back to a state of a life without God. How is this relevant to you and I today? It is, no matter what community that we live in, it's important that where we live in does not compromise our faith and our identity, specifically our identity in our faith. When we're going to different communities, be it living in the West, in the East, wherever it may be in the world, if the community that we're living in is going to compromise our religion, our faith tradition, then it is a community that we need to be mindful of. Is it my action? Is it the surrounding? Is it my ability to cope with everything that's around me? If I know for certain that I can't live in this community, I can't live in this society because I'm completely letting go of my faith, I'm completely assimilating into the society that I'm in, and I've lost my heritage, I've lost my identity. If I'm doing that, then realize that we're going against the basic principle that the Prophet established, which was, listen, we've migrated, we've escaped persecution, we've found a safe haven for ourselves to practice our faith, to be Muslims. But if you're living somewhere where it's not allowing you to be a Muslim, then the world is a very big place. Go and find a place for you to practice your faith, for you to be able, even if that practice of your faith is in your own home, by mere virtue of you existing and living somewhere, if you can't practice your faith because of the surroundings that you're in, you need to contemplate what's going on with your situation. La ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah, there's no going back to being uncivilized, as in not having Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life, not having Islam in your heart. There's no going back to that after we've escaped this religious persecution. Again, looking at specifically whether it be in this particular analysis of Shia Muslims as a minority group, or even Muslims as a minority group at large, be in the United States, in Canada, the UK, wherever it may be in the world. Again, East, West, these are challenges that we face as a socio-religious group across the board in whatever community that we're in. Sometimes some of these challenges are even experienced in practice in places where supposedly people actually have the same faith as you. But when it comes to the implementation of religious practice, it can be challenging at hand as well. So the concept here being, we have to preserve our faith, our identity in faith, and we can't sacrifice that for the place that we're living in and the opportunities that come our way. But instead, there has to be this effort to integrate, as coined by many different scholars in many different traditions, but with Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam and with the Prophet, as in that we exist in those communities in a way where we're integrating effectively. Why? Because isolationism is not an option, and assimilation in its pure sense is not an option either. The Prophet ﷺ gives us this instruction through Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, where Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, talks to his companions and he says, do not remove your hand from the people. People need each other. If you remove your hand from the people, they lose but one hand. You on the other side, you lose many hands. Do not remove your hand from the people. People need one another. This idea being what? We have to engage in society in a way where we're not neglecting them and we are not being neglected. Imam Sadiq tells his companions, he tells his followers, who they, as the sixth Imam, living at the transition between the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid Empire, he would tell his followers, listen, we're a minority group, and I want you to go to their mosques, go to their funerals, go and give them condolences, visit their ill ones, engage with them. He mentions a number of different examples in this narration. And then he emphasizes, again, people need one another. You have to engage with people. This reference was as the Imam, who is the leader of the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, a minority group, telling them, listen, in our community that we're existing in today, I want you, with the rest of the majority, with the rest of people who are of a different school of thought, I want you to engage with them. Those are your brothers and your sisters in faith. And if you are going to neglect them, then you're going to be neglected. Go to their mosques, go to their funerals, take care of their ill ones, ask about them, talk to them, engage with them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, as we mentioned in the previous nights, He's created us as nations and tribes so that we may get to know one another. The acknowledgement and the celebration of diversity itself is a divine mandate. It's not something that is just a mere convenience or an accessory for us. It's a necessity. So when we're looking at all of this and we're bringing it all together, we've looked within the community and we're looking right now at a more exterior lens and looking from the outside and seeing, now I have this concept of self, this concept of identity. I know those 4 spheres of identity that we discussed in the previous nights. I need to really know, as a worldview for myself and the narrative that I possess as a minority community, how do I see my engagement on all levels? Socially, economically, politically, religiously, on all levels, how do I see my engagement with people that are different than me as a minority in the community, in the society that I live in? Finally, we're going to talk about the story of Hamad, one of the companions of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. This companion of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he experiences what we asked in this question number 5, as in, what was the litmus test for Hamad's success as a Muslim living abroad? So the experience with Hamad was the following. Hamad was a merchant, a businessman, if you will. And Hamad left the cities of the Muslims. He left Medina, he left Mecca, he left the area that was considered to be the land of Muslims, right? And he sought a new life in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, neighboring the Muslim Empire, was one that there was some opportunity for people, especially in business as merchants, to find opportunity, economic opportunity for a better life in certain aspects in that empire. So Hamad was one of the individuals who took advantage of that, and he moved to the Byzantine Empire. He didn't disconnect completely from his home, being Medina, but instead he remained in contact and visited as often as he could. Every time that Hamad would go back and visit Medina, though, people would scorn him. They would ridicule him. They would make fun of him, mock him, and say, oh, Hamad, you're coming back from the Byzantines? Oh, the disbelievers? You're going to be resurrected with them on the Day of Judgment. Don't you know that? Don't you know that when you live with the people that you become one of them? And you're living with a bunch of disbelievers, so we're pretty sure you're going to be resurrected as a disbeliever with the rest of them. And Hamad was really bothered by this. He was troubled so much so that one of these days that he was visiting, he goes to the Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he complains to the Imam about how people have been ridiculing him and how people have been talking to him. He was really bothered by it. I mean, imagine you leave home and you're coming back and you're visiting, and people are just dogging you for living somewhere else now. Oh, you left us. You're with those people now. You're not one of us anymore, etc., etc. And some of us may have had similar experiences in the past. So Hamad is complaining to the Imam, and the Imam looks at Hamad and he says, Ya Hamad, oh Hamad, when you were there, do you remember our cause? And do you call for it? Hamad paused for a moment and he said, yes, my Imam, I do. Then the Imam asked, Hamad, if you are in these cities, the cities of Islam, do you remember our cause and do you call for it? Hamad put his head down and said, no, I do not. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam then reassured him and told him, Ya Hamad, if you are to die and you are to be resurrected, on the day of judgment, you will be resurrected as a nation of your own, and light will be beaming before your hands. Now take a moment to allow that to sink in. For you and I, who may have come from communities overseas, we may have come from the Middle East, from South Asia, from different parts of the world, and many of these parts of the world being where Islam is practiced heavily by majority communities. As Muslims generally, without just looking at the context of the socio-religious identity that we mentioned as that core identity of being Shia Muslims, followers of Ahlul Bayt, but generally as Muslims, that many of us can relate to the sense of living abroad and living in different regions that are not majority Muslim communities, and how we feel about that. So Hamad is being told by Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam that, Hamad, listen, the litmus test for you here is what? Are you remembering our cause, the cause of Islam, the cause of Ahlul Bayt, the cause of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad? Are you living this? Are you committing to this? He's saying, listen, when I'm living abroad, I am. But I'm living here, I don't. I'm not remembering the cause of Ahlul Bayt when I'm living in those cities. But rather, when he's abroad, he is. Now apply that to you and I. The community that we live in, the city that we live in, the places that we're working in, that we're living in. A lot of it is by our choice. By our choice, what is the result of the place that we live in? The litmus test here is, are you living for the cause of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them? If you are, regardless of where you're living, then you're good. And if you're not, then that's something that you need to contemplate. And regardless of if you're one person, 1,000 people, or 100,000 people, no matter how big or small your minority group, even if your minority group is simply you in this grand space that you're living in, you could be resurrected as a nation of your own by the mere virtue of your commitment to your faith and your belief and the cause of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them. Now, brothers and sisters, we've covered all these questions. We've gone through all of this, and we've seen that throughout the tradition of Ahlul Bayt, the Holy Prophet, the prophets before him, the traditions of the Quran, that really when it comes down to it, this engagement that we have as a community, as a religious community, a minority that exists in whatever society that we're in, we have to be mindful, heed to the idea that in order for us to protect ourselves and safeguard the generations to come, we cannot isolate ourselves. And at the same time, we can't assimilate in a way where we lose our identity. The path forward, and the path has always been in the tradition of Ahlul Bayt, is active integration. Inshallah, next night, tomorrow, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this idea of active integration and what it means for us to truly, whether you're looking at it from the African-American example of the program of assimilation through self-assertion, or we would say in a better simplified version, integration itself. What does that look like? Practically speaking, how do you and I integrate into our society? We're going to quickly go over the questions that we answered to make sure that we have all of them as a summary. Question number 1, that we addressed, which was, have Shia Muslims been a minority community? Have they always been a minority community? Yes, Shia Muslims have always been a minority community on a general level, with the exception of some experiences like modern day Iran and the Safavid Empire that have existed. Secondly, what was the program of assimilation through self-assertion? As we explained, that was the program by W.E.B. Du Bois, coined to encourage African Americans as a newly enfranchised group to integrate into their society without the loss of their identity and their heritage. Third, how does isolationism harbor animosity? We've said that on both sides, whether the one that's perpetuating the animosity and the hatred, or the group that's actually the recipient of it, the victim of it, minority groups need to be mindful that if you are less engaged with the society that you're in and you're more isolated, that could possibly bring more harm to you, even though it's not justified whatsoever. But by mere virtue that even those groups may themselves be more isolated, it doesn't help when a minority group itself is more isolated. And by mere virtue of the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, encouraging people to engage with their society, go to other people's mosques, go to other people's funerals, go to their gatherings, and make sure that you are seen there so that people know you as a human being and connect with you on that very basic level. That when we're looking at number 4, after religious persecution, a person should be safe to stay committed to the principles and practice of their faith and not lose it. This idea of the history of religious persecution that took place at the time of the prophets, at the time of the imams, and even today, and making sure that we're not falling short of the directive of the prophet of لا تعرب بعد الهجرة, which is no going back to a state of godlessness in our life after we've migrated, after we've saved ourselves from religious persecution. We mentioned the examples of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who took a group of Muslims by the direction of the Prophet to Abyssinia, modern day Ethiopia, and Prophet Musa alayhi salam, who escaped to Midian to save himself and save his people eventually as well. And fifth and finally, the litmus test of Hamad's success, one of the companions of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, who was a Muslim living abroad outside of Muslim lands, outside of a Muslim community, was his ability to live for the cause of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And that's something that we need to apply in our lives, as in, where are we? Where did we come from? Where are we? And where are we going? This is a constant reflection for us to make sure that we're on track. Thank you for listening, brothers and sisters. Inshallah, we'll continue the conversation tomorrow at the same time, and in the coming nights, inshallah, in the building of this vision of a virtuous community. هذا والحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة والتسليم على نبينا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.